So Walter, you mentioned Henry Kissinger and perceptions of most important events in recent history, and in fact, to answer the questions of does Europe misunderstand Obama's victory, I'd say they might even have misunderstood it twice. If I look at the current polemic about the qualities of leadership of the US president. And so one of the elements for that is, of course, the perceptions, including the historical perceptions that the Europeans have about America. And so I will perhaps, instead of leave that for the Q&As, but go back and to give some kind of a historical perspective a little bit. And that goes back to the main themes of the book. To me, Henry Kissinger said about JFK, I think is greatly overrated, which in fact I agree with. And that has to do precisely with the perceptions that the Europeans have on America, American presidents, republicanism, and the Democratic Party in the US. There were two themes, in fact, that did prompt me to write this. The first one, back in 2007, when Iraq was a dominant theme in international politics, and everything American had to be analyzed through the question of the war in Iraq and the war on terror more generally. I thought that, first point, Iraq in 2008 would not be, and war would not be the prime issue of the elections, because there was this unseen, unanalyzed, totally overlooked, growing anxiety of the middle class in America about the future of the economy and jobs. That was, of course, vindicated then with the economic crisis, but at the time was not particularly predictable, at least in terms of magnitude. That was point number one. Therefore, that social and economic issues and the reinvention of the social contract in America would be the growing theme moving up towards the election in 2008. The second point, which is perhaps a contradiction with the first one, to some degree, was that despite George W. Bush and the despicable opinion that Europeans generally and overwhelmingly, in fact, had of the US president from a number of perspectives, that despite that, it was not obvious at all that a Democratic candidate would win the election in 2008. And that has to do perhaps with the subtitle of the book, Why America Will Not Change, in the sense that a good Republican candidate could perfectly succeed despite the GOP being in shambles to George W. Bush in 2008. To some degree, there was one condition for that, of course, and that was that a Republican candidate would be unconventional enough and would also be sensitive to the first point, that is to say, to not only to security, national security issues, but also have a new perspective, a rejuvenate, so to speak, the compassionate conservatism claimed by George W. Bush in 2000, and be attentive and sensitive to social and economic issues. And in that sense, there would be some kind of a convergence toward the center from the Republican candidate and the Democratic one, when it was a little more obvious that Obama had a pretty good chance, which was not at all predictable at the beginning, especially in the primary process, that he would have a chance to make it, to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. In their respective speeches, one could see that there was a convergence of the two candidates toward the center. And in the sense, John McCain sort of answered the profile of the candidate and the only candidate able to win the White House in 2008. Anti-Bush, totally unconventional, and having, which is the historical perspective I wanted to mention, having Theodore Roosevelt as some kind of a model, in the sense that the convergence toward the center would be the legacy of progressivism in American politics. And progressivism in American politics, that's also a European perspective that the Europeans often miss, is not a monopoly of the Democratic Party, but was invented as a political party by a Republican president, a little unconventional and a little maverick like John McCain was. In fact, John McCain claimed that his hero in American politics was Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican president who, in fact, sort of opened new windows in American politics, and these windows have been opened wide by his distant cousin, the Democratic president, FDR, that of course everyone knows in Europe. The Roosevelt images in Europe, of course, a turnaround FDR, but TR is often overlooked, when in fact it tells you a lot about American politics. and the historical development for progressivism in American politics. So we had in 2008, at the end of the day, two candidates marching toward some sort of a center, conscious of the fact that something had to be done, not only in national security matters, but also as far as the social contract in America was concerned. Then, of course, there was the unpredictable, which was the Lehman Brothers episode, the crisis, and the mismanagement of both the campaign and the crisis itself by the Republican candidate, who said 3 times that the fundamentals were good, when in fact Obama had a very pedagogical and simple message to say we have to avoid a crisis of credit, because a crisis of credit will lead to a crisis of confidence, and that worst thing we're going to have to face. And therefore then you had Obama's election, which the Europeans misunderstood in the sense that, as I said, because of this march toward a new center that would be bipartisan, at least in spirit, if not in action. In action is quite difficult, and we see this now. But a march toward a new American consensus, in a way, McCain coming from the right, if you wish, and Obama coming from the left, so to speak. The Europeans misunderstood that, in the sense that there would be a legacy of conservatism in Obama's actions, in Obama's policies. He had inherited a reformed Democratic Party, adherent to budget balance, adherent to very cautious discourse on the freedom of guns, on abortion, and there was there what we would call in Europe a center-right candidate more than leftist candidates. I think this was greatly overlooked, and that has been infused in the discourses and in the actions and the first steps of Obama's policy domestically. And to finish on this, and to conclude, I said the Europeans to some degree have greatly overlooked that, analyzing the election through national security issues primarily. But to some degree they've also misunderstood, and that was I was saying, they've misunderstood it twice, because I'm not sure that the style, if you wish, of the president means that he is weak. And we'll have an occasion, of course, to discuss that with the French-American perspective that you've introduced in your remarks. There is much to do about this leadership issue. I think the leadership style of the French president and the American president is extremely different. We have someone who is enormously energetic, prompt to action, and we have someone here in the US who is a thinking American, who is a cerebral president, who analyzes things perhaps a little bit too much. So there is a contradiction in saying that he doesn't take action, and at the same time he's not wise because he doesn't listen to advices, when in fact he actually takes some time to weigh arguments in order to try to find the best way. That's the way I feel about it. Try to find the best way to implement a vision that is a long-term vision, that may be in contradiction with immediate interest and with immediate perceptions by the Americans themselves, but that are meant to fulfill long-term objectives that are transformative, that are historical because of their reach. And I believe these are not only national security matters, taking into account the shifting of cards, and clearly I agree with you, the shift of power, influence, and energy to Asia that the Europeans also overlooked a little too much. But, and that would be the last point, I think trying to reinvent an American project, including domestically, that is to say, and I think everyone, the healthcare debate vindicates that. Everyone is conscious of the fact that something has to be done. What is another question, but something has to be done to reinvent a social contract that could be as sustainable as the social contract that was created by the New Deal and FDR.